Hello, my name is Emma Tobias, and I am filming on an actual camera today because I am borrowing my mother's camera, and two things. One, it doesn't have like a flip screen, so I don't know if I'm in focus, nor do I know if I'm really in frame. I'm guessing, I'm assuming I probably am in frame. And number two, you are propped up, the camera, I mean, on a can of used Pringles. So I'm still trashy, but it's just in a higher quality. So that's good. Anyway, I recently just got back from BookNet Fest about a week ago. It was an amazing experience. I love BookNet Fest. It's the second year I've gone out of the 2 years it's been happening, and I really loved it. And this year was so inspiring. And I was really inspired to make videos that were a little deeper or delved into something or had like more discussion videos. That's really what this channel started as, and I've kind of moved away from that and I want to get back into it. So I thought I would start today by talking about two of my favorite things, romance and chick lit. And I want to have a really open-ended discussion. There isn't some grand point to anything I'm saying, although I feel like I'm going to try to make a grand point and fail, so apologies. And I would just love to know your thoughts as I get into this. I'm not an expert, and if you know more, please educate me. This is just coming from a place of thinking about romance and chick lit, and the differences and the similarities, and sex in the two genres. So yes, I will get into it. So, romance and chick lit are both genres I have been reading since I became a reader, like a more intense reader, at 13 or 14. I really love romance and chick lit, and they're very different genres, but I feel like they're sisters of each other. So romance, as most of you know, is a genre that's full of tropes, for better or for worse. It normally always has a happy ending. There's always conflict, and sex, and steaminess, and ta-da. And within romance, there's lots of different subgenres. You can have sci-fi romance, historical fiction romance, you can have contemporary romance, going on and on and on. And then chick lit, which chick lit, we can talk about that too, is a little bit of a sexist term, I would think. Chick lit? Chick lit is a genre that is normally contemporary. It's in the contemporary, like, umbrella, and it's normally about a woman who has a big journey emotionally through a story. There's conflict and plots and romance most of the time, but it's normally centrally about a woman who's having an emotional journey and learning something about herself as she goes along. Think Sophie Kinsella. So they tend to be more like romantic comedies, where romance tends to be a little, like, sexy. Okay, that was awkward. Moving on. So what I think is really interesting, and something that I always think about between romance and chick lit, are the fact that there's normally very explicit, or maybe not super explicit, but there is sex described in romance, and there isn't really sex described in chick lit. Normally there'll be some kind of verbiage about two characters having sex in a chick lit novel, but you don't get the nitty-gritty, you don't get all the deep metaphors. It's more of a fade to black situation, where romance tends to be pretty, like, you know what I'm saying, like, his da-da-da and her doo-doo-doo. We literally talked about in BookNet Fest how, like, just say the thing, and I'm not saying the thing, so apologies. But yeah, that's a big difference, the fact that there tends to be more sex and romance and not so much in chick lit. And I don't really know why. I'm assuming just because if it's a genre convention, a chick lit book would probably just become a romance novel, maybe, if there was sex. That might be a question that we could talk about in the comments. If you put, like, explicit sex into a chick lit novel, is it still chick lit? Is chick lit defined by the fact there isn't explicit sex, or is chick lit defined by the fact that a woman is having an emotional journey and she's a central figure, although that also sometimes happens in romance, so I don't know. Also, something I think is really interesting is that romance tends to be a very American genre, meaning that, like, some of the most famous romance writers are here in America. America has a very exciting, for better or for worse, romance publishing industry, where chick lit, most of the most famous chick lit writers, like Sophie Kinsella, Jenny Colgan, etc., are in the UK. When I go to England, and I've been twice, so it's not like I'm some sort of expert, obviously, when I go into a bookstore in England, they sometimes have, like, a women's fiction, which is something that chick lit is also called women's fiction, a women's fiction section full of those books. where you don't really find that, at least in my experience, in American bookstores. There's not normally this like big women's fiction section, and maybe if there is, it's populated by British authors, which I think is really interesting, and I'm curious why that is. Why did that happen? Is it something to do with the publishing industry? Does it have to do with culture? If you're from the UK, maybe you can give me some insight on why that seems to be, or maybe you can tell me that I'm just dead wrong. So I also kind of want to talk about this idea of the two genres and how they almost always are called guilty pleasures, both romance and women's fiction. But what I've seen lately, at least on BookTube, is that romance is being seen as like, okay, like people are more accepting of people, just women, men, whoever, reading romance. It's more like normal now and people are more okay with it. When I first started booktubing, it was very much seen and looked down upon, but now more people are excited about, more people are willing to talk about it. It's really awesome. Women's fiction is something that I very rarely hear people talk about on BookTube. Besides like a Sophie Kinsella novel, I don't really see a lot of people talking about chick lit or women's fiction, and in some ways you could see it as like more flighty. Let me get to why people might think that, and this is again just my opinion. Romance is very exciting. There's sex, there's action, there's all these subgenres. People get really into it, very invested. People can be like, oh, I'm reading it because I just want the steam factor. I'm reading it for this, this, and this. Women's fiction is very much centralized about women's emotions. And not saying that doesn't happen in romance. There are emotions, and women are a big part of romance, and they're the largest part of romance. But women's fiction is solely really touching on a woman's journey to find herself. I recently read Wild Like Me by Louise Pentland. I talked about that in my last video. That book doesn't really even have a big sweeping romance. The book is almost completely about Robin Wild's journey to accept herself more. And when I was reading reviews of it, a lot of people found that to be very boring and uninteresting. They didn't really care about this interpersonal life. So chick lit, in some ways, you could say, if it doesn't have that romance factor, is kind of more like literary fiction, and the fact that you have these characters delving into their emotions, having these journeys to find themselves, but it's not put with literary fiction because it's fluffy, and it's very heartwarming, it's kind of hallmarky, but in some ways, the emotions that these women are having are just as valid and just as deep. You could be like, oh no, it isn't just as deep, they're not exploring all the intensities, and there's a happy ending. But that's okay though. In some ways I think that still means it's not any less important exploring these kinds of feelings that women are having. I don't know if any of this is making sense, but I just think it's interesting the way that we even think or like accept romance in women's fiction. I know a lot of people who are great with everything and cool about it, but I do see like it's more like there's more acceptance towards romance, and people are accepting of women's fiction but still kind of look down upon it. I ran out of memory, so still a trashy affair. Anyway, like I was saying, I don't know if that's completely true, what I just said about women's fiction being seen, like looked down upon more and being seen as more frivolous, but that's sort of the impression that I've gotten from other people when I've talked about women's fiction or chick lit versus romance. People get the appeal more of romance and think that women's fiction would be just boring, which you could think about that as like really something to do with people not caring about women's inner lives, people not caring about that kind of thing, people not caring about things that are coded very feminine, which Hallmark Channel and women's fiction and chick lit and all of that are they're very coded as feminine, they're very feminine and very like looked down upon, and they're less, I guess, exciting in terms of the fact that there isn't really sex as heavily portrayed in women's fiction versus romance, and maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's just a big pile of so many things, and just in general, both genres there's still a stigma, but I feel like women's fiction gets a different kind of stigma thrown against it. I don't know if any of that just made sense, but I would love to know your thoughts about it. I would love to hear what you guys think, and if you have thoughts. I didn't do a lot of research because I really wanted a super raw, like, honest take on it, like what I thought about it from years of reading and just talking about romance and women's fiction, and I would love to know what you guys think. So I hope you have a lovely day. Bye!